Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. Today, we wanted to do a special show analyzing the interaction of extreme faith and extreme patriotism. The essence of the American spirit is characterized by a deep sense of patriotism and a commitment to the principles of liberty and justice for all. Hope you enjoy our conversation of how the principles of religious liberty have been woven into the fabric of American society from its inception. I'm your host, Orland Johnson, and let me introduce you to our special guest for today. First, we have with us Dr. Philip Wesley, who's also the chaplain for the Prince George's County Police, the Special Crimes Division 4. We also have with us Chaplain Angela Lee, who's the Associate Director of Chaplain Ministries here for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us also our Second Lieutenant, Lemuel Sapien, who's the Deputy Commander for the Senior Public Affairs Office of the Civil Air Patrol. And then we have Chaplain Andrew Harewood, who is the Deputy Chief of Chaplains for the United States Army Reserve. Gentlemen and lady, glad to have you here with us. Looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, I was looking at a matter the other day as it related to what I would call faith and patriotism. And the members of the Knights of Columbus, they wanted to celebrate Memorial Day service at Freedom Memorial Park. For the past 2 years, the Park Service has actually barred the Knights from holding a Memorial Day Mass in Poplar Grove National Cemetery, saying that the religious service must instead take place in a nearby free speech zone. The Knights and their attorneys say the park officials have violated their First Amendment, as well as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and they've been writing in a letter trying to see if they could get this policy to be undone. You know, Chaplain Wesley, when I take a look at these type of issues, the idea of you've got individuals who are looking to go out and celebrate Memorial Day, one of the most powerful days as it relates to patriotism and something we celebrate here in the United States, but they're being barred by being in a public or what I would call a national park simply because there is a connection to, quote unquote, that this is a religious activity, it's a mass, it's something along those lines. It seems as though we start to see a struggle when it comes to how can I, quote unquote, show my faith at the max, but also show my patriotism at the max. When you hear these type of things and some of the things that you've had to deal with and even, you know, counseling and advising, how do you come down on some of these type of topics? And what should our audience know about these things?
Well, you know, one of the things they were talking about, it's attracting onlookers. But, you know, you're in a specific place to do this. And in order to be successful in this, it has to be in this specific place, according to Knights of Columbus. And so, you know, what needs to happen in this instance is a clear definition of what can be. Is it something that's patriotic? Is it something that's religious? I think both can be accommodated, especially if it's in a secluded place where you're just honoring the day and you're honoring the occasion. I don't think it's a violation of anybody's rights to do that. So hopefully this case can be resolved in the fact that they are doing something to bring honor to not only the day, but also the location that they are doing the service with.
You know, Chaplain Sapien, you've been an individual who obviously you're right now out in the Far East doing activities. And when you hear about the opportunity for someone who wants to celebrate patriotism and celebrate their faith at the same time, and you start to see pushback taking place in all kind of corners of society, what's your thoughts on that? And even thinking about it from your own personal experiences standpoint.
Well, my personal standpoint is that we should respect people's underlying beliefs, especially religious beliefs when it comes to that. But there are some complications, especially when it comes to law, constitutional law. First Amendment does guarantee free exercise, but it also has the establishment clause. We don't want to run afoul of items. So going back to what the Park Service is trying to do is trying to not put itself afoul of the establishment clause as to put itself as, endorsing a specific type of religion in that sense. So we kind of have that particular balance in play, and it gets kind of complicated. So sometimes we may need a legal expert to come and comment on that. But personally, I would say I don't see a big problem with it having a religious service because it is a public ground and it's not specifically tailored to a specific religion, but anyone should be able to come and perform a service there on public ground, as it does not, in my view, violate any establishment clause whatsoever, because we're not saying, oh, only the Catholics or the Knights of Columbus are able to do a service there. Anyone should be able to do that. And so it does not, in my view, violate the establishment clause.
No, Chaplain Harewood, you're an individual who has been in congregations, pastoring churches. You've been obviously out in the military, advising from a chaplaincy perspective, which is unique in that you're not necessarily proselytizing what you may believe personally from your religious perspective, but you've got a role where you have to be almost a spiritual or counselor or faith leader to individuals of many walks of life. And when you hear something like this about someone saying that, you know, I don't know if you can be that patriotic in conjunction with being that religious, how do you kind of come down on these things? And how do you think we should maybe even advise public and others that may be unfamiliar with these quote unquote concepts to understand what works best and what doesn't?
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for being here. And I think my colleagues have pretty much really kind of drilled down into the iceberg. As Dr. Wesley mentioned, you know, definition is critical. Anytime you get into that slippery slope of what is church, what is state, are you violating the rights of state? You're violating the rights of church. It becomes a little slippery. I think to a large degree, some of the burden that the state usually have in trying to make sure that they're not violating the rights of those from the church is also protecting the rights of the clarity of the state. We're in a space now where we have all these different types of religions, not just the traditional religions of Judaism or Christianity or Islam, or even, quite frankly, the denominations of those religions. Part of the cautionary piece that individuals from the state side is trying to protect is, well, you know, if you're saying that this is what you believe, is it a true practice? All right, because does that practice have legitimacy? And how is that legitimacy being lived out in community, which gives that practice legitimacy? So having that very clear definition is key first. And then lastly, which I think is the opposite side of the same coin, is I think one of the reasons why when individuals are going to have an activity in a space that belongs exclusively to the state, that's the reason why they like to have them apply for a permit, so that in the application process of the permit, they can start adjudicate. Well, this piece is right, this piece is not right, this is piece. So it starts with a clear definition of what is it you're trying to get after.
You know, Chaplain Lee, you find yourself in a unique situation. You've worked on activities as it relates to military and healthcare and many different walks of life. I imagine that you've probably seen those who have talked about, I want to be patriotic, I want to be more engaged. You've even seen people who have said, listen, I want to be working at this quote unquote healthcare facility, but I would like to maybe have off for my Sabbath, depending on when you celebrate and things of that nature. You know, how have you found yourself having to really advise and to assist in this particular space?
Sure. I've learned so much already from our colleagues here. And to me, at the core, I don't think that faith and patriotism is mutually exclusive. And I think when we boil down to it, it's supposed to be promote love, defend, and encourage, and even support the good of the nation and the people. And so I feel that it is important to express our religious belief, to practice or to support the country. But in a sense, we have to be very sensitive of the overall picture, and that to see if this is promoting diversity, or is it more of a making things are more exclusive to certain groups. I don't know if I answer your question.
Yeah, but then Chaplain Harewood, this is one of the struggles I see. The military, as many of you are aware, can really like the idea of a certain amount of uniformity. because that kind of helps from a discipline standpoint. And when you have individuals who come to the table with different viewpoints that are foundational in their religious beliefs, how do you juxtapose the two and still allow them to peacefully coexist?
Roger. And I think it's an excellent question, Orla. And I think going back to the first item in terms of definition, because there are times when we find ourselves trying to argue around false principles, if I can say that. Religion at the core is an extremely personal issue, but is also a very deeply protective issue. And I think that we're in a space where the idea of being patriotic, juxtaposed to being religious, at times can be viewed as binary. Like, you can't be authentically one without being being pro something doesn't always mean being anti something else. And if I could be very blunt, in this moment where individual, you look at my paint job, right, and you see what I look like, and individuals might feel that, well, for me to be pro me, it means I'm anti something else. We've got to be really careful. I could be pro African descent, but I'm not anti something else. Similarly, I think there are times when people believe that once you hold on to your religious practices and beliefs, that somehow you're anti. Now, the challenge is that we're now in this confluence of space where some of the political pieces, the state pieces, and not necessarily the positive pieces, are now creeping into the religious, water well, so to speak. And so I think the work that Chaplain Lee and my colleagues here are doing outside the military, because the military, we're very rigid and clear in terms of this is an apple and it says R.E.D. delicious. It is not blue. All right. Very clear. All right. And so if you choose to violate that, there's something called the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. We will take money from you or rank from you or kick you out. So there's consequences. Whereas when you're in other organizations, you don't have that hook, so to speak, to correct the behavior. So I think really what chaplains find themselves in right now is a very unique, but also very beautiful place where they can say to leadership, hey, you can be extremely patriotic while still holding on to your faith. Or you can still be tremendously religious while also being patriotic. But I think that definition of how you define being patriotic, how you define being religious, has to be the foundational principle when you're starting to get after some of these complex items.
Yeah, and I just want to say that, in addition to that, Dr. Hayward, military, law enforcement, as a chaplain, we're very cognizant of different beliefs around us. So I think in this instance, it would be the same practice. It would be the same principle where we're coming to pray, but we're not coming to push one religion over another, but we are there to express faith in unity and do something very special for the community.
Well, I'm going to let that be the last word, Dr. Wesley, but I think the idea that it sounds like I can be doing my faith on high and my patriotism does not have to be diminished in any way, and society really has got to come to grips with that. I want to talk about this case that's called Di Liscia versus Austin, in which we have one of the Navy's most prominent admirals once said that he would not tolerate any violation of the rights or privileges of sailors who grow beards. But today, Navy policy requires that all sailors be clean-shaven, even if their religious beliefs require them to wear a beard. This policy actually put an individual by the name of Edmund Di Liscia, who's an Orthodox Jewish sailor, in a predicament. And he can serve the country he loves, or he can abide by his religious convictions. For years, he has been in a position where he was able to reconcile these two and really be in a position where the obligations of both were allowing to take place. But it seems as though a change in commanding officer seemed to create a change in what he's being allowed to do. Angela, one of the dynamics of being able to kind of, for example, be a chaplain or to be in the military or to be working in a healthcare organization is sometimes your religious beliefs actually have an appearance that's part of what's going on. I worked in a case not too long ago where we had a Muslim young lady who was told at Abercrombie and Fitch that you cannot work here because you wearing your hijab does not fit our looks policy. You know, somebody may want to say, but you working here in this healthcare field, if you don't look a certain way, our quote unquote, patients and customers may not feel comfortable. As a result thereof, we'd like for you to do something different. When you hear those type of arguments and those type of decisions, and when you think about your mandate as what you've been called to do as a chaplain under those circumstances, how do you find yourself having to attack those things that may come up from time to time?
Yeah, I think it's a very sensitive issue and it's case by case. It depends whether we're causing harm to the people we serve, or it's just something that we are adhere to a certain protocol for in this institution. And so honestly, it really depends. And I've heard that for me, as a female chaplain working in a hospital before, well, you need to put a little bit more lipsticks on, you look pale. Or you cannot wear jewelry to work. But it is a very fine line. And also, I think as a person, you have to also be comfortable with where you're working. If it becomes a hostile environment to your own preferences, I have to think twice. And a lot of times with patience and understanding and actually communicating clearly what the organization is looking for and also the meaning behind the protocols helped, to navigate those situations.
But Chaplain Lee, let me follow up on that point. When some people have a religious belief that simplicity is more than quote unquote extreme, and somebody may be looking to have what I would call maybe a lesser amount of lipstick or a lesser amount of makeup for reasons that according to their religious beliefs is something that makes sense. What happens now when you've got a job that's actually alluding to that and kind of giving the impression that may be what we'd like to see happen? Does it require somebody having to come back and say, but wait a second, you may be crossing the line as far as my religious beliefs are? Or maybe do we come to the conclusion that the institution itself is really what should be, at the forefront here?
And I think we are all called to uphold, love and righteousness. And a lot of times we are not here to be cowards, So in a sense, boldly and courageously challenge the institution sometimes is necessary.
Lieutenant Sapien, when you think about being bold and having to challenge things in order to be able to move forward with your beliefs, I'm sure there have been times where you've had to ask yourself the question, do I go down this road or do I acquiesce? I can tell you guys my own personal story. I remember when I first went to law school and the first exam they told me was on Sabbath. I was so frightened about what I needed to do. I actually went and took the test. And then later on, I saw a couple of Adventists that didn't. And they looked at me and said, hey, they give us on another day. You should have just asked. But I found myself feeling so pressured by the circumstances around me. It didn't seem like I was willing to go out and get into the battle. And I'm wondering, are you seeing similar circumstances or even what your own personal story may be?
Yeah, wasn't it was it Thomas Jefferson who once said, and I'm paraphrasing, in terms of style, go with the flow. When it comes to principle, stand as a rock. When we talk about principle, especially when it comes to our personal beliefs, religious beliefs, that is one of the most sacred things that person can hold. And it is enshrined in our Constitution and the United States Constitution, and is the sacred right for every single individual. When we talk about patriotism, it's part of our identity as Americans, and that is, I believe, part of patriotism is to hold a particular belief, even if you don't have a belief. The right to your conscience is what is part of our identity as Americans, and I believe strongly, not just because I took an oath to defend the Constitution, but also because of my personal conviction that there is a God, and I have the freedom. I should have the freedom to worship Him thoroughly. Now, going back to the case at hand, and we're talking about a Navy sailor who unfortunately is in this pickle or predicament because he's not going according to grooming standards, according to what his leadership is requiring him to. Actually, in the United States Air Force, we have waivers for that. I can't speak much for the Navy per se, and I think even in the case of the Navy, it depends on the leadership and how much their chaplain corps is advising their leadership on this. But if I were a chaplain advising a commanding officer, I would really emphasize that if there is no real compelling interest for the government, even if there was, we need to approach it in a way that restricts their practice as least as possible. According to law. And so the advisement may be taken into consideration by my command or not, but at least I've done my part in advising and letting them know that, hey, this guy, he has a deep-seated conviction, and as part of his identity, religious identity, to hold this.
Well, Chaplain Wesley, you and I, spent a lot of time in New York, and ironically, I see this incident happening in the Navy, but I actually remembered that the New York Yankees actually have a rule that you can't have facial hair on that team either. And I find everybody who comes there seems to shave if they want to play baseball. I guess what I'm trying to understand is if the Yankees can force you to shave in order to play baseball, why is it necessary for there to be what I would call, an accommodation? The military is something that's voluntary at this point. Individuals that join the police department, come there because it's something that they desire to do. Why is accommodation so important, in particular from a religious standpoint, when you have this uniformity that also seems so critical?
Well, that's first of all, that's why I'm a Mets fan, New York Mets fan. That's why I went that way. Second, in law enforcement, you are, they have the same conflict, especially religious, having a beard and how long can the beard be? Because when you put on the face mask for a gas mask or any other protection, it needs to be able to fit on your face without any compromise. So that's the main reason. But it's still a discussion. It's still something that is very passionately discussed amongst others. When I first decided to get into ministry, my hair was twisted down to my shoulders because, I'm coming from wanting to be a rap artist to now wanting to be a preacher. And so the question was, well, are you going to cut your hair? So that was the main question. If I get up there and preach and I had my hair long, what's going on with him in the pulpit with his hair long? So we faced those discussions through time. Now, my late father, who was a pastor, allowed me to speak with my hair long and did not force me to change it. Through time, I just got tired of it. I cut it. But it wasn't forced on me. So I get how it is, not to be forced to do something. I think it's a passionate discussion, especially when it comes to, hey, this is my identity. This is who I am. If somebody comes to the workplace with long braided hair or dreadlocks, that becomes a discussion. So where does that balance? And I think there can be a balance. I've seen it happen. We've seen it happen in Hollywood. We're seeing it happen in so many other instances. The question is, where is that healthy balance where I can still be me, but still follow, safety precautions or still represent the organization that I'm with?
Well, Chaplain Harewood, you and I have even talked about this a little bit. Doesn't it get a little tricky when you've got a commanding officer that may, be saying one thing and maybe the next commanding officer says something different? But then there's also this procedure and the protocol that you have to go through, because maybe what we have here is not something that you automatically have a right to, but you have the permission to actually seek an exemption. Once you get the exemption, then now that right triggers. Or am I thinking about this the right way?
No, you're spot on. And I mean, unfortunately, there's about 6 things that have actually clocked in my mind. I know we don't have the time to go through all of them, but I think at the end of the day, what we recognize as chaplains, especially at my level, we advise, commanders decide. All right. Accommodations at times, especially across the services, can look differently. And I think that becomes a part of the problem, quite frankly, because some services do accommodations. I'm not going to say wrong or right, but in a manner whereby they do not use the same litmus tests and the same scorecard. And so a person gets a pass in one service, and it creates a nightmare for others in another service. Different discussion, that would take a whole nother show. But here's the thing: what I would say to my commander, point blank, is that, and I don't remember the Supreme Court case. It might have been Madison formation or something like that. But basically, I would remind the commander that conscience has rights, right? Because conscience has duty, and so there's a higher power that the conscience is resting upon, and so because it speaks to one's credibility, when your conscience is under duty to a higher power, and that's the reason why our Constitution starts "In God We Trust," or "We the People," right? And so I think that while individuals can argue the different rights, whether it's gun rights or rights to speak, et cetera, what gets lost in the sauce so often is the rights around conscience. And I think we, the church, traditionally have kind of shied away from that, where the chaplaincy has kind of made its bedrock and said, whoa, no, you can't do this. You can disagree with it. It can even make you uncomfortable. But it does have duty, and so therefore it has rights. I know our time is almost gone. I would say in terms of the length of the beard and some of the other accommodations that are made, and I think one of my colleagues made mention to it, the services may actually have some very clear stipulations around where, hey, do you want to keep your beard, or do you want that when that gas mask goes off, the beard can be sealed and your life is sealed? Because remember, you held up your hand and you says, I pledge to uphold the Constitution within the context of this particular service. So there's a lot here to unpack. Our time is gone. But ultimately, I would advise that commander that, sir, I know what you want to do, ma'am, I know what you want to do, but just understand that conscience has rights because conscience has duty.
Well, I'm going to have to let that be the last word, Chaplain, but I just want to thank all of you for being here and helping us to have a little bit of a better understanding of how I can go out and be doing what I want to do from a maximum level as relates to my faith. And there's no reason why I've got to be less patriotic in any way. Thank you again for being here with us, and hope you enjoyed our show. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.